We're watching something unprecedented unfold right before our eyes. For decades, we've been told that American power is absolute, that our word is final, that when Washington speaks, the world listens. But what happens when that's no longer true? What happens when a Mexican president stands firm and an American president backs down? This isn't just about Trump and Sheinbaum. This is about a fundamental shift in global power that most Americans aren't being told about. While our media distracts us with partisan theater, China and Russia are actively reshaping the economic architecture of the world. They're building alternatives to the dollar, creating new trade partnerships, and offering developing nations a choice they've never had before. Mexico just demonstrated that choice. Sheinbaum spoke and Trump retreated. That would have been unthinkable 20 years ago. The empire isn't what it used to be, and the implications for every American worker, every family trying to make ends meet, are enormous. Let's break down what's really happening here. Let me start by asking you a question that gets to the heart of what we're discussing today. When did you first notice that the world was changing? Was it when you saw Chinese electric vehicles flooding global markets while Detroit struggled to compete? Was it when Russia survived sanctions that were supposed to cripple its economy within weeks? Or was it just recently when you watched an American president threaten tariffs against Mexico, only to see Mexico's president calmly refuse to bend and then watched as those threats evaporated into nothing? Because that moment, my friends, that moment when Claudia Sheinbaum stood her ground and Donald Trump backed away, that wasn't just a diplomatic exchange. That was a symptom of something much deeper, something that's been building for decades while most Americans were told to look the other way. Let's talk about what's really happening here, because the mainstream narrative you're getting is incomplete at best and deliberately misleading at worst. For the better part of a century, the United States has operated on a very simple principle. We make the rules and everyone else follows them. We built institutions after World War II, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the entire Bretton Woods system, and these institutions were designed with one primary purpose: to maintain American economic and political dominance over the global order. And for a long time, it worked brilliantly. Countries that wanted to trade internationally had to use dollars. Countries that needed development loans had to accept our conditions, which usually meant opening their markets to American corporations, privatizing their public assets, and abandoning any economic policies that prioritize their own workers over foreign investors. This was the Washington Consensus, and it was enforced not just through economic pressure, but through military might. Step out of line, and you might find yourself facing sanctions, coups, or in the worst cases, direct military intervention. But something fundamental has shifted, and that shift accelerated dramatically over the past 2 decades. China's rise isn't just about manufacturing cheap goods anymore. We're talking about a country that has become the world's largest trading partner for over 120 nations. Think about that number. More than 120 countries do more trade with China than they do with the United States. That's not a temporary blip. That's a structural transformation of the global economy. And China didn't achieve this through military conquest or regime change operations. They achieved it by offering something the United States increasingly couldn't or wouldn't offer: development without political strings attached, infrastructure investment without austerity requirements, and trade relationships based on mutual benefit rather than subordination. Now let's bring Russia into this picture, because what Russia represents is something the American foreign policy establishment absolutely cannot tolerate. Russia showed the world that a major economy can survive being cut off from Western financial systems. When the United States and Europe imposed what they called the most severe sanctions in history after the Ukraine conflict began, the expectation was clear: Russia's economy would collapse, the ruble would become worthless, Putin's government would fall, the Russian people would rise up and demand a leader who would cooperate with Western interests, except none of that happened. The ruble stabilized. Russia found new markets for its energy exports. It deepened its partnerships with China, India, and the global south. Its economy adapted and in some sectors even grew. Now, I'm not here to cheerlead for Russia or to minimize the human cost of war. What I'm pointing out is something that terrifies Washington, the demonstration that America's most powerful weapon, economic sanctions backed by control of the global financial system, has lost much of its effectiveness. And this brings us directly to Mexico and what just happened with Sheinbaum and Trump. Mexico is not China. Mexico is not Russia. Mexico is right on our border, deeply integrated into the American economy through NAFTA and its successor, USMCA, and historically has been firmly within the American sphere of influence. Mexican presidents, with rare exceptions, have generally understood that there are limits to how much they can challenge the United States. The economic relationship is too intertwined, the political pressure too intense, the historical examples of American intervention too numerous to ignore. So when Trump announced his intention to impose tariffs on Mexican goods, unless Mexico did more to stop migration and drug trafficking, the traditional playbook would have Mexico's president scrambling to make concessions, to show Washington that they were cooperative, to do whatever was necessary to avoid economic punishment. But Claudia Sheinbaum didn't follow that playbook. She responded with something we haven't seen much of from Mexican leadership in recent decades: dignified refusal. She made it clear that Mexico would not be bullied, that migration is a complex issue requiring cooperation, not coercion, and that threatening your third largest trading partner with economic warfare is not a strategy that serves anyone's interests. And here's what's crucial. She could take that position because the global context has changed. Mexico doesn't exist in the same isolated position it did 20 or 30 years ago. China is now a major investor in Latin America. Russia has expanded its diplomatic and economic presence in the region. Alternative trade arrangements are emerging that don't run exclusively through American financial institutions. Sheinbaum knew something that Trump perhaps didn't fully grasp. Mexico has options now in ways it didn't before. Let's dig deeper into what those options actually mean, because this is where the abstraction becomes concrete and affects real people's lives. When we talk about China's Belt and Road Initiative, we're talking about over $1 trillion in infrastructure investment across Asia, Africa, Latin America, and even parts of Europe. We're talking about ports and railways and power plants and telecommunications networks that connect regions that were previously isolated from global trade. And crucially, we're talking about an alternative model of development. The old model, the one enforced by the IMF and World Bank, said that if you're a developing country and you need infrastructure, you have to accept loans with conditions. You have to cut government spending, usually on healthcare and education. You have to privatize state assets, usually selling them to foreign corporations at bargain prices. You have to open your markets to foreign competition, even if it destroys your domestic industries. And if you do all of this, maybe eventually you'll develop. China's model, whatever its flaws, and it certainly has them, offers something different. China says we'll help you build infrastructure that you actually need. We'll provide financing at competitive rates. We won't demand that you restructure your entire economy to benefit foreign investors, and we won't overthrow your government if you make economic decisions we don't like. Now, is this altruism? Of course not. China benefits tremendously from these arrangements. They get access to resources, markets for their goods, and political influence. But here's the key difference. The countries involved also get something tangible. They get ports that work, roads that connect their regions, power plants that provide electricity to their people. And most importantly, they get to maintain some degree of sovereignty over their own economic decisions. This is why the American foreign policy establishment is in such a panic. For decades, the game was rigged in our favor. Countries had no choice but to play by our rules because there was no alternative. But now there is an alternative, and countries are taking it. We're seeing it in Africa, where nation after nation is reducing its dependence on Western institutions and increasing partnerships with China and Russia. We're seeing it in the Middle East, where even traditional American allies like Saudi Arabia are diversifying their relationships and considering joining BRICS, the economic bloc led by Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, that now includes several other nations and is actively working to create alternatives to dollar-dominated trade. We're seeing it in Latin America, where left-leaning governments that would have been targeted for destabilization in previous decades are now surviving and even thriving because they have options beyond Washington's approval. And this transformation in global power relationships has direct consequences for American workers, for American families, for the economic future of the United States itself. Because here's the uncomfortable truth that neither major political party wants to discuss honestly. The American standard of living for the past several decades has been subsidized by our position at the center of the global financial system. The dollar's status as the world's reserve currency means that other countries have to hold dollars to engage in international trade, which means they're effectively lending us money at very low interest rates. This has allowed the United States to run massive trade deficits year after year, importing far more than we export, without facing the kind of economic crisis that would bankrupt any other nation. It's allowed us to finance government spending and military adventures through debt that other countries buy up because they need dollars for their own trade. It's a form of what economists call seigniorage, the profit that comes from being able to print the money that everyone else needs to use. But what happens when countries don't need dollars as much anymore? What happens when China and Russia settle their trade in yuan and rubles? What happens when Saudi Arabia starts accepting yuan for oil sales? What happens when more and more international transactions bypass the SWIFT system that the United States controls? The answer is that America's ability to live beyond its means starts to erode. The cost of our debt goes up. Our trade deficits become more painful. The contradictions in our economy, the massive inequality, the crumbling infrastructure, the unaffordable health care, the student debt crisis, all of these problems that have been papered over by our privileged position in the global system suddenly become much harder to ignore. And this is why Trump's retreat in the face of Sheinbaum's refusal is so symbolically important. It's not just about tariffs on Mexican goods, it's about the recognition, however reluctant, that the United States can no longer simply dictate terms to its neighbors and expect compliance. Mexico knew that imposing those tariffs would hurt American consumers and American businesses just as much as Mexican ones. Mexico knew that disrupting supply chains that have been integrated over decades would cause chaos on both sides of the border. Mexico knew that American automakers depend on parts manufactured in Mexico, that American consumers depend on Mexican agricultural products, that the economies are so intertwined that threatening one is threatening both. And Mexico also knew something else, that they could reach out to other partners if the United States became too unreliable. China would happily increase investment in Mexico. Other Latin American nations would support Mexico in standing up to American bullying. The international community, watching the United States become increasingly erratic and unreliable, would sympathize with Mexico's position. So Trump backed down, and the media largely moved on to the next controversy without examining what this moment actually means. But we need to examine it because it's part of a pattern. It's part of the same pattern we saw when the United States couldn't prevent China from helping to broker a diplomatic breakthrough between Saudi Arabia and Iran, longtime enemies who are now talking because China facilitated those conversations. It's part of the same pattern we saw when African nations at a summit with Russia explicitly rejected Western lectures about who they should and shouldn't trade with. It's part of the same pattern we saw when India, despite American pressure, continued to buy Russian oil because it made economic sense for Indian consumers and Indian development. The pattern is clear. American power to compel other nations to act against their own interests is declining. Now, I want to be very clear about something because I know how these discussions often get distorted. Pointing out that American global dominance is eroding is not the same as saying that China or Russia are going to become benevolent global leaders. Power is power, and any nation that achieves global dominance will exercise that power in ways that benefit its own elites first and foremost. The Chinese government is authoritarian, it suppresses dissent, it has serious human rights issues that should concern anyone who cares about human dignity and freedom. The Russian government is autocratic, it has invaded a neighboring country, it has its own record of suppressing opposition and controlling information. These are not moral exemplars, and we shouldn't pretend otherwise. But here's what we also can't do. We can't pretend that American global dominance has been some sort of benevolent empire spreading democracy and prosperity. The historical record doesn't support that narrative. The United States has overthrown democratically elected governments and replaced them with brutal dictatorships when those democracies threatened American corporate interests. We've supported apartheid regimes, monarchies, and military juntas as long as they were pro-American. We've invaded countries, bombed countries, sanctioned countries, causing immense human suffering, usually in the name of abstract principles like freedom and democracy that somehow never applied when our allies were the ones doing the oppressing. The global system we built and enforced was designed to benefit American corporations and American elites, not to lift up workers anywhere, including American workers. And that's the tragedy of this moment. As American global dominance declines, we have an opportunity to rethink everything. We could invest in our own infrastructure, our own people, our own communities. We could build an economy that works for working people rather than one that extracts wealth from workers and concentrates it in the hands of a tiny elite. We could engage with the world as one nation among many, seeking cooperation rather than domination. But instead, what we're seeing from our political leadership is denial, escalation, and doubling down on failed strategies. Rather than accepting that the unipolar moment is over and adapting to a multipolar world, we're told that we need to confront China more aggressively, sanction Russia more severely, reassert American leadership more forcefully. This is a recipe for conflict, instability, and ultimately for a decline that will be much more painful than it needs to be. Think about what we could do with the resources we're pouring into maintaining a global military empire. We have about 800 military bases in more than 70 countries around the world. We spend more on our military than the next 10 countries combined. We maintain aircraft carrier groups in oceans far from our shores, ready to project power anywhere on the planet at a moment's notice. All of this costs enormous amounts of money, money that could be rebuilding our infrastructure, providing healthcare to our people, making education affordable, addressing climate change, lifting people out of poverty. But we're told over and over that we can't afford those things. We're told that providing universal healthcare like every other wealthy nation is too expensive, that free public college is unrealistic, that a Green New Deal is a fantasy, and yet somehow we always find money for more weapons, more bases, more interventions. The connection between our global empire and our domestic decay is not coincidental. They're two sides of the same coin. An economy organized around permanent war and global domination is not an economy that serves the needs of ordinary people. It's an economy that serves defense contractors, oil companies, financial institutions that profit from maintaining the dollar's dominance, and a foreign policy establishment that justifies its own existence through the constant manufacture of threats and enemies. This is why the decline of American global power doesn't have to be a bad thing for most Americans. It could free up resources and attention for addressing the very real crises we face at home. But that will only happen if we fight for it, if we demand an economy and a foreign policy that prioritizes people over empire. What Sheinbaum did, what China and Russia are doing, what we're seeing across the global south is not just about geopolitics. It's about the fundamental question of who gets to make decisions about how resources are used, how economies are organized, how societies are structured. For too long, those decisions have been made in Washington in consultation with Wall Street and corporate boardrooms, with little input from the billions of people affected by those decisions. The emerging multipolar world, with all its uncertainties and dangers, at least opens up the possibility that other voices will be heard, that other models will be tried, that the Washington consensus is not the only way to organize a modern economy. And here's where this connects directly to you, to your life, to your future. Every time a country successfully defies American economic pressure, it makes it a little bit harder for corporations to threaten American workers with moving jobs overseas. Every time an alternative to the dollar emerges, it makes it a little bit harder to finance endless wars through debt. Every time a developing nation builds infrastructure with Chinese investment instead of IMF loans, it demonstrates that austerity and privatization aren't the only path to development. These global shifts create space for us to imagine and fight for a different kind of economy here at home. But we have to be honest about the challenges too. The transition from a unipolar world dominated by the United States to a multipolar world with multiple centers of power is dangerous. Declining empires often lash out, and the United States has a massive military arsenal and a political class that seems incapable of accepting that American dominance is not a permanent feature of the global order. The risk of conflict, even catastrophic conflict, is real. We're already seeing increased tensions with China over Taiwan, continued conflict in Ukraine, instability in the Middle East, and proxy conflicts across Africa. Each of these situations could escalate in unpredictable ways. This is why it's so important that ordinary people in the United States understand what's actually happening and why. The narratives we're being fed by mainstream media and both political parties are designed to maintain support for policies that serve elite interests, not yours. We're told that China is a threat that must be contained, but we're not told that American corporations have spent decades moving jobs to China to exploit cheap labor and avoid environmental regulations. We're told that Russia is an enemy that must be confronted, but we're not told about NATO expansion or the role of Western powers in Ukraine's internal politics. We're told that we need to maintain American leadership, but we're not asked whether that leadership has actually made our lives better or whether it's primarily benefited those who profit from empire. The world is changing, whether we want it to or not. The question is whether we'll understand that change, adapt to it intelligently, and use it as an opportunity to build something better, or whether we'll cling to fantasies of permanent dominance while our infrastructure crumbles, our people suffer, and our planet burns. Scheinbaum's moment of defiance was small in the grand scheme of things, but it was significant. It showed that even close neighbors of the United States, even countries deeply integrated into our economy, are finding their voice and asserting their interests. It showed that the old rules are breaking down, and it showed that power, real power, is shifting in ways that most Americans aren't being told about. So pay attention to these moments. Pay attention when countries in the global south refuse to join sanctions against Russia. Pay attention when Middle Eastern nations diversify away from dollar-denominated trade. Pay attention when Latin American countries choose Chinese infrastructure investment over IMF austerity. These aren't just foreign policy stories happening far away. These are stories about the structure of global power, about who gets to make decisions, about what kind of world is possible, and ultimately they're stories about whether we'll have an economy that works for working people or one that continues to extract wealth upward while offering nothing but debt, insecurity, and empty promises to everyone else. The empire is declining. That's not a moral judgment. It's an observation of historical reality. The only question is what comes next. and we still have some power to shape it. But we can't shape it if we don't understand it, and we can't understand it if we accept narratives designed to keep us divided. So question why we confront, sanction, and dominate. Ask who benefits, what we're giving up, and what we could build instead. The emerging world will be shaped by those with courage to imagine something different,